people have a little bit of a different understanding of what goes on with Native people. And David has sent me some questions. And I might be able to answer some of these questions in my little talk. And afterwards, if anyone does have questions, you can ask me then. Actually, I was pondering a while on what I was going to share today, and before I kind of said, what should people pray for when they're praying for the Indigenous people? But before I tell you this, I want to go back in history and share with you some events that shape what the Indigenous people are today. The British asked the Six Nations to fight the Americans during the American Revolution. They did, and as a result, they could not go back to their home, which was just south of Lake Ontario in the United States. So the British gave the Six Nations a piece of land on the Grand River, 6 miles on each side from its source to its mouth. And the mouth is in Lake Erie, I believe, and the source is, well, way past Kitchener. So it's way up there. So 6 miles on each side of the river belong to the Native people. Now, we don't have that anymore. We have a reserve out near Brantford, and it's not, I think the land approximately was 950,000 acres from the land that the British gave us, and now it is down to 46,000 acres, and that's 4.9% of the original land. I want to stress the fact that the traditional role of women as one of leaders. The clan mothers chose the chiefs, and if the chief did not do his duty, they could dehorn him or put him out of his position and put another in his place. Women were consulted before any major decisions were made. Women were valued. This changed over the years, and the government said that the tribe of each person would go through the father's line and not the mother's. This was the first of many things the government had changed. The government's goal was to assimilate the Indian in the white society. This would be a way of getting rid of the Indian problem. The Indians were considered heathens, dirty savages, and they were considered nothing. Residential schools were set up, and the government got the church to run the schools, and the police went to the different reserves and took the children right from their homes and brought them to these schools. I remember my cousin had married a girl from one of the northern reserves, and they had twin girls, and they went up to visit, and their grandmother told them they could play outside, but if they saw a big black car, they would run into the house as fast as they could, because those big black cars, if anyone saw kids playing, they would just grab them and take them away. So the parents didn't have any idea where their children were going. And a lot of these children did not come back because they died in the residential schools. They would cut the hair. It almost looked like putting a bowl over your head and just cutting the hair right off. They all had to wear uniforms, and they couldn't speak their language. If they did, they were punished. They were beaten if they were caught talking. They were abused physically, emotionally, sexually, and mentally. Many children died in these schools, and their parents were never notified. This is an example of cultural genocide. Another way of getting the children out of their homes was something called the 60s scoop. And in the 1960s, the government was trying to think of another way to assimilate the Native people. And the government knew that they couldn't get the adults to change. So they knew they could get the children to change. So the 60 scoop was another method of assimilation. The police went into homes and took the children, and they were put in foster homes and adopted into non-native homes. And the adoptive parents were told that all these children were orphans. The reason I'm telling you this is to stress the fact that the Indigenous people believe that whatever significant event happens, it will affect the next 7 generations. I now come to present day. The Indigenous people have lost a lot of their teachings and language, and as a result, we are seeing a breakdown of values. People are on drugs, alcohol, and as a result of this, we have spousal abuse, children abuse, suicide among our young people. The government sent the RCMP up to the North Reserves in order to shoot all the sled dogs to prevent the natives from hunting and fishing. And this was a way of getting rid of them, because if they couldn't hunt and fish, then they would die. Right now, we have many missing and murdered Indigenous women. You might hear about it on the news. When you call the police, somebody's missing, whatever, they don't take it seriously. But now that it is out in the open and people are going to the government, they're going to the newspapers, they're going, and it's getting into the papers that the police now have to do something and try to get them. But there are so many, and the families just want to know what happened to them, and if they're out there someplace, they want them back. And the government actually says that these women are not a priority. So that's today. That's not a long time ago. This is today. The Trudeau government has stated that an inquiry will be set up to look into this matter. The commission will run from September 2016 to December 31st, 2018. The Minister of Indigenous Affairs has said that prejudice plays a key role in what has transpired. Racism and sexism in this country kills. The reserve system also was a form of assimilation. Natives were placed on reserves and had to get a pass from the Indian agent when they wanted to leave the reserve. Women in Canada were allowed to vote in about 1918. Asian Canadians were allowed to vote in 1948. The First Nations were allowed to vote in 1960. So there's quite a few years between that. And if they could vote, they could vote earlier if they gave up their native status. And that was a way of getting them to assimilate. If they didn't have any status, then they'd have to assimilate into the white culture. Also, a lot of, during the war, a lot of Native men and women joined the army or whatever to fight in the war. And if they fought for Canada, a lot of them would lose their status. So a lot of them went to the United States and joined the armies over there so that they could help. Catherine's great-grandmother was one of the first Native nurses to nurse during the war. And she went to the United States so that she could do this. So it's just, we try to do the best that we can, but we have to get people behind us, people to help us. And the government says it's behind us, but you just, you don't know what their ulterior motive is. What can people pray for? We can get our values back. These values are being taught in school, and we could have those. I was talking to David earlier, and when he was in school, and when I was in school, in any history book, it was the savages and the fighting. They were always fighting. They were savages. They never, ever told our history. And now this history is being told in our elementary schools. And it's, when people are finding out that all this happened, they can't believe it. Why didn't we know this earlier? And it was just because the government wanted to get rid of us. They wanted to get rid of the Indian, they called it the Indian problem. If we do all this, we'll get rid of the Indian problem. And they didn't think, because the natives didn't know English, especially up north, they thought they were crazy, they thought they were stupid, and that's why another reason they took the kids away, because they wanted them to have a good family. Whereas, and you know yourself, I mean, every family is different. Every culture is different as they raise their children. It doesn't mean that it's not a loving family. And I had a girl I knew was one of the 60 Scoop girls, and she found out what had happened. She was from Saskatchewan, and she went back and she actually found her family. She found 3 sisters and a brother and her grandmother. Her mother had since passed away. So she got connected with her family, and every one of them in that family were in this 60 Scoop. So I just can't imagine what children would feel when they left their families. And they were young children. Now, have you heard of the orange shirt? Okay. Now, I'm saying, I'm not all families, not all children were kidnapped and put in the schools. In some instances, people would go around, especially a little bit like in the South where we are, they would say, you know, if you send the children to this school, they're going to get a better education. So a lot of them, okay, they're going to get a better education and we'll send them to this school. And this little girl was getting ready to go to this school, and she was really excited. And her mother went out, didn't have that much money, but they bought her a nice orange shirt and a new pant or a new dress and shoes and everything. She was really proud to go. And the very first thing they did was take her clothes and give her this uniform, and just, you know, it was just awful. I couldn't imagine what the little girl went through. And she never, ever got her orange shirt back. And so the orange shirt things that are going on now are to remember and to fight for, you know, the kids that died in these residential schools. People can't believe that kids died in the school, were buried in graves that there was no headstones, there was nothing. And they have to go back to the schools and see if they can get a list of things. And, you know, a lot of the girls unfortunately got pregnant from the priests at the school, and those babies were murdered as soon as they were born. So, you know, there was a lot of genocides. There was a lot of just terrible things, and a lot of people that went to residential schools want nothing to do with the church, because it was the church that ran the schools. It was the Catholic Church, it was the Anglican Church, I believe there's a Presbyterian one someplace. And so it was the church that ran this, but it was all from the orders of the government. The Indian Act, if you've heard of the Indian Act, I've got this book, it's called 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. And if you'd like to read that, I'll let you see the book, and it's written by Bob Joseph. And it's helping Canadians make reconciliation with Indigenous people a reality. And one thing I'd like to read, now over the years, parts of the Indian Act have been revised and to make things a little bit better. But this is one thing that I read in here, and it says, the Indian Act has not achieved its goal of getting rid of the Indian problem. Indigenous culture is openly celebrated by Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. The Indigenous population is the fastest growing segment of Canada, Languages are being revived and recorded. And there are increasing instances of local governments recognizing original names of towns, sites, and streets. Indigenous communities and individuals are proudly rebuilding their nation. So after 150 years of rule, it's time to scrap the act. What would it look like? In the next section of this book, they're going to take a look at what the government might look like without the Indian Act. So, but that's a lot of things, because there are some good things in the Indian Act. So if they're going to scrap the whole thing, I'm not sure what's going to happen. So we pray for our leaders that the Creator will give them the wisdom they need. We pray for healing and 7 generations of positive things happening. The Native people, the people of the Longhouse, are spiritual people in touch with nature. They are caretakers of this land. They realize that what we do to the land today will affect the people of tomorrow. Not just our people, but all people. We have a rich culture that we almost lost, and we need to teach our young people so that they can be proud of who they are. Now, do you want some questions now, David?
Hello? Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Linda, for sharing. I'm here, guys. I'm in the back. I need to move the computer, so I'll be asking you some questions. So, 제가 린다한테 좀 질문을 드리려고 몇 가지 준비를 해놓은 게 있어요. 그래서 그 질문들을 제가 파워포인트로 보여드리고 린다한테 한번 질문해서 답을 하도록 하겠습니다. 이거 이외에 또 추가 질문 있으시면은 질문 다 끝난 다음에 또 손을 들으셔서 직접 질문을 해주시면 됩니다. So Linda, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions right now. So the first question. Okay, does indigenous people have their own government, and who rules the town? 우리 원주민 마을에 또 별도 정부가 존재하는지, 그리고 누가 마을을 통치하는지.
Okay. Yes, they do have their own government, and this was part of the Indian Act. They were to have a government, and it was to be elected every 2 years. So they have a chief and they have councillors. But on my reserve, they also have what's called the hereditary chiefs, which are the original Longhouse people, and they have their own government. And since the council has been set up, these two groups are kind of fighting, but the government only recognizes the government that is being elected. They don't recognize the hereditary chiefs as having any authority.
So just an add-on question to that is, does that mean that the Six Nations Reserve itself has separate laws outside of Canadian laws?
No, not really. We have the same. We have a police force. It's a native police force, but it upholds the laws of this country. Yeah. Okay.
So the second question is, you mentioned about the clan mothers being part of the leaders during your document. So does that mean the chief always has to be a female?
No. As I was telling David before, the clan mother is a part of the original hereditary chief Longhouse religion. And the clan mother is the head of the family. Everything goes through the mother. And the clan mothers choose the chiefs. And if a chief's not doing their job, they take that job away and give somebody else the job. But they also are consulted if there's any important issues happening. They consult the women. So the women have a very important role in the hereditary chief's way of life. Not so much with the elected council and those who don't go to the Longhouse, but in the Longhouse they still practice this with the clan mothers.
Next question is, how is the indigenous status achieved? Does the mother have to be Indigenous in order for the children to become Indigenous?
According to the government, as long as you have at least one parent indigenous, then your children will be Indigenous. Until it's like a blood quantum effect. Like if we have two Indigenous people and they have children, their children are status. But if one of those children marry a non-native, then their blood level is not going to be the same. And then if through the years that more and more non-native people are coming, then there's not going to be enough. There is a line where if it goes below that line, then you can't get your status. But right now, it doesn't matter if the father or mother is Indigenous; the children will get their status.
Okay. Next question is: can Indigenous people work outside of the reserve?
Yes, because the reserve offers only so many jobs. There's a few jobs on the reserve, but there's not enough for everybody. So a lot of young people, when they go off to university, will go off into jobs. And we have Indigenous people. We've got doctors, we've got lawyers, we've got scientists, we have teachers. Everything, any occupation we have, and a lot of them have to go out to work because there just aren't the jobs on the reserve.
Next question is: why are the Indigenous people not trying to leave the reserve, or why are they trying to leave the reserve?
The reserve right now is our home. It's where we live. We own the land. The only stipulation that we have is if we want to sell the land, we have to sell it to another Indigenous person. We can't sell it to somebody who's not Indigenous. So people, it's their home. It's beautiful. A lot of you've been down, right? And you can see, we've got some really nice homes down there, and a lot of it's out in the country. Also, there's some perks to living on the reserves that we don't have to pay land tax. And if you work on the reserve, you don't have to pay, your tax for working. And there's no sales tax. Okay. If you move off the reserve, you have to pay the land tax. If you work off the reserve, you have to pay tax for that as well.
Okay. And just moving on to that, what are the benefits given to the Indigenous people from the Canadian government?
Well, one of them is I just mentioned that you don't have to pay the taxes on your land and work and such. We are issued a status card, and it's everyone's calling it Indigenous and such, and the government puts on the status card Indian status, so they still think of us as just Indians. That Indian status will help us if we are going to buy something off the reserve. We can use that to save on the tax. Schools on the reserve are under the government. If somebody wants to go on to post-secondary education, they can borrow money, not borrow money, they are given money to go to school. The only stipulation they have is that if they don't pass their course, they have to pay that money back. If they pass the course, then they're fine, and they can go on to that. We have our health is under Indian Affairs, and what was the other one? I didn't write it down. Anyways, if she thinks of it, she can tell me. In the schools, I taught on the reserve my whole career, and our school, because it's in Ontario, followed the Ontario curriculum. The only thing that we changed was that we put our history in that curriculum. And now the curriculum in the province of Ontario, and I'm hoping in the other provinces as well, is including the true story of the Native people. I'll tell you a little story about my grandson. He was in grade 8, and they were doing Native studies, and he came to me and he says, I want to do something on Native studies. So I had a whole bunch of books and a whole bunch of stuff ready. So I gave it to him, and he did. It was a beautiful project. Beautiful project. And, but it told the right story. And his teacher gave him a C. And I said, a C? That's, to me, I would have given that kid an A+. Like, he really worked on it. And his mom went, and his mom went to the principal, went to the teacher, and the teacher said, well, I've never heard that before, so how do I know it's true? And she wouldn't change the mark. So, but now the teachers are learning that that is true. And I'm just so sorry that he didn't get the mark. I told him I'd give it to him, but it didn't matter.
Okay, next question is, many people think that Indigenous people have no desire to work as they're getting enough fund from the government. Is this true?
No, this is not true. Most Indigenous people that I know work. I mean, they have to provide for their family. The government just doesn't come and hand you money. As many people think they do, they don't. So people are working, they have good jobs, and they're providing for their family. And if they have a house, they work on the house, make sure everything's up to, code and all this and that. We do have people on welfare, like any other place in Canada and Ontario. People that are down on the luck or whatever, and maybe even people who are maybe into drugs or something and can't work and are just sick. There is welfare, but they have to show that they really need this as well. But no, they desire to work and they want to work.
Okay, next question. You mentioned about Longhouse. What exactly is Longhouse, and is this a religion?
Today, we call it the Longhouse religion. And in olden times, as I said, the women, everything went through the women. The women were in charge. And so they built they were actually long houses. And they were long enough to hold maybe 3 or 4 families, whatever. And what happens is that if your daughter married someone, she and her husband would move into her mother's longhouse, and they would live there. If the son marries, then he would move into his mother-in-law's longhouse, and they would live there. And that's where the longhouse came. It was a long building, but long enough to hold several families. We don't live in longhouses anymore. But we do have the longhouses, which now represent their religion. They just call it the longhouse, and they say the longhouse religion. And if they're going to the longhouse, they say, well, we have a feast today, and we're going to the longhouse. So we know that they're going there.
So what does the Longhouse religion all about? What do they believe in?
They believe in the Creator, and that He has made everything. They have clans. And a lot of these clans, they're all animal clans, and each tribe has their own clan. I belong to the Seneca tribe, and my clan is Turtle. And a long time ago, if you belong to the Turtle clan, when you got married, you have to marry somebody that's in the Turtle clan. Now, doesn't count anymore. So they have, I think, about four feasts every year. There's the spring one where they pray to the Creator to give them good crops. There's one in the fall where they thank the Creator for providing crops for them. There's a midwinter one that they have, and each one's about a week long. And they're there, they're singing and praising the Creator for all He's done for them.
Okay. And just a question about the foster care. People may think that placing the Indigenous people into the foster home is a benefit to that child as they will live in a better household. But you mentioned that that is not always the case. So what are the things that children have to go through during this period?
Well, they're away from their own people. If now I'm presuming you mean like a child that is an orphan that has to go into, or maybe a child that's been taken away from their
Child
parents.
has been taken away from their parents.
Okay, for one reason or another. Right now, if an Indigenous child is taken away from their family and they're looking for a foster family, that family has to be Indigenous. With the 60 scoop, they were taking them out and putting them in the non-native home because they thought they'd get a better life, they'd get a better education. It doesn't make, you can't say that a child is going to have a better household just because they're with a non-native person. There's many households, and the native people, if you know a lot, are very happy people. They're always telling jokes and all this and that. They punish their children by telling them stories. If the child does something wrong, they tell them a story about a child that did this and what happened to them and how they shouldn't do it. So they didn't hit their children, they didn't discipline them that way. They disciplined them by telling them stories that would get them to think of, oh, maybe I shouldn't do that. So I would think these children are in a good household where they are, but if they are taken away from their parents, they should be put in another household where there are Indigenous people. Because it's kind of hard, because a lot of non-natives have no idea what the native culture is, what the native people learn and teach their children. And so they're going to teach them what they know, right? And so to take that culture away from the child isn't good.
And the question is, what is the most important thing that you need, Indigenous people may need from the non-Indigenous people right now?
Right now, I think the best thing is to educate yourself. Educate yourself into what has happened, what is happening now. This is a good start, and you can read this, but there's a lot of books out there. There's a lot of things that you can read and educate yourself so that you know something of what's going on. Because you can't help somebody if you don't know their history or their background. It's just impossible.
I think this could be the last question. What is the most important thing that you need from Christians right now? And to add on to that, what are the things, some of the evangelist method that you would like to happen in the reserve right now?
Well, the very first thing, I talked about education. You have to educate yourself. But when you're coming into the reserve, you've got to get to know the people. You've got to get to make them friends, right? And you're not going to start preaching right at them right away. They'll turn you right off, right? Now, I don't know, how long have you been coming down to our church, David? Quite a few years now.
Almost 10 years now.
Right. And I consider we're friends, right? We're friends, and we know you a little bit, and you know us a little bit. But you didn't come right in and just start charging, and then just pushing religion kind of down our throats. I think with the first missionaries that came to Canada, they figured that the Indigenous people were stupid, lazy, savages, and so they needed this. They needed to go to God. They needed God, but they didn't bother to see what their religion was like before, and that didn't turn out very well. Okay? Now, does anyone here have a question? I might not be able to answer it, but David sent me his questions. So I had an idea what to do. But does anyone else have questions?
Long time ago, when I attended one of the volunteer work at the reserve, we were told to call First Nations people, not Indigenous people, or Indian. So what's the proper term to use?
Well, right now it's Indigenous, I guess. And that's not from us. I think that's from the government and people, you know, we should call them Indigenous, or we should call them, used to call us Aboriginal, First Peoples. We call ourselves the Hanundesones, or I can't think of the other one now. People of the forest. But anyways, we have our own names. But I was always called an Indian. And I went to the Sky Dome one year, and they were having a powwow at the Sky Dome. And they asked for teachers to come, and during the afternoon they brought kids from all the schools in Toronto that applied, and we were going to teach them different things. And it wasn't very long. I think we had about 25 minutes for each session. And mine was the smoke, what's that called? You know how you, the sage and the... Smudging. Since I'm getting older, I'm losing words. I don't know if that happens to anybody here or not, but it's smudging, and it kind of cleanses them with the smoke. So that was what I was going to teach that day, and I had a book and everything. We did all that, and I kept referring to India. I kept referring to Indians, and once in a while, if I remembered, I'd say Aboriginal or something. One lady came down after and she said, "We don't call them Indians anymore." And I said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I was raised and I was called an Indian all my life. And I just, I consider myself an Indian. So it takes me a while to remember not to call myself an Indian." And she looked at me with her mouth wide open and walked away. But yeah, so right now it's Indigenous. Anything else? Yes.
I don't know how to call the president living, territory of living.
Oh, I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
I don't know how to call the place you are living. That's the territory or the village or Six Nations?
The Six Nations?
That's Six
Yeah, the
Nations.
Six Nations of the Grand River we're called. And we still live along the Grand River.
My question is how many percent of the people go to church, or how many percent of the Christians are there?
No, I don't know that, because we have quite a few that are the Longhouse religion. We have on the reserve, we have the Baptist, the United, the Anglican, the Seventh-day Adventist, and the Jehovah Witness. So we have those religious groups on the reserve too. And then we have a lot of people, we have a lot of people that don't go to Longhouse or to church. And we've got to get them going someplace. Okay.
I also have some additional questions to ask. I was talking to Kat earlier about this too, but I also want to hear your opinion. Well, the thing about the reserve, when we think about the reserve, the first thing that comes to our mind is drug addicts and sexual abuse and all those kind of things. It seems to me that those are the more commonly happening in the reserve than the outside of the reserve, like in Toronto. Or I'm pretty sure some of the other cities are experiencing those things as well. But then why do you think it's happening more? Why do you think there is more high ratio in the reserve with those kind of criminal activities?
I really don't think there is. I think because the reserve is such a small community, and we have kids on drugs. We have kids from abusive families and things like that, and it seems more and more. But it's because we're such a small community. If you go to, I don't think it's anymore like Toronto. You've got such a big population in Toronto, and I don't know what the percentage of people are on drugs or addicted to anything or abuse and that. But you have that, and I don't think it's very much different than on the reserve. I really don't. And I mean, it's a problem. I'm not saying it's not, it's a problem. But compared to other communities, I think we're pretty equal. Okay? All right?
I have one more question.
Oh, go.
Some reserve countries, they cannot have their own land. They don't have ownership of the land. They just have ownership of the building. For example, if you have a house, building is yours, but not the land. Is that correct?
Well,
Or is it different from reserve to reserve?
Yeah, pretty well it's the same. Like, on my reserve, Six Nations, like if I lived on it, which I don't, if I lived on the reserve, I could sell my house and the land to somebody else that lives on the reserve. I couldn't sell it away from the reserve. Right? And I'm not sure about all the other reserves, if they're the same or not. I kind of think they are. It's just that, but I mean, you just can't sell your house.
The house was in full state, so when we asked them, well, then we're gonna lend us money because we don't own the land.
Okay, well
We just get the loan.
that's different than from ours, because people do get loans from the council to build houses, and there's a long list. You can't take a mortgage out on the land, on the house, because if you don't pay your bills, the bank can't come and take your house, because they can't come to the reserve, and they're not native people, so they can't take it. So we can't get a loan from the bank. But the council will loan up to so much money for you to build your house. Yeah. Yes? Yeah, you can rent a house. Yeah. Like you personally? Why would you want to, Esther? I don't think, well, no. But it's a long story. The reserves are made for Native people. And if somebody that says married, somebody that's not Native, technically they can't live on the reserve. People do. They bring their spouse and they live on the reserve. But if their neighbors complain about them, then the council will come and tell them to get off. Okay? So you don't really have that security, and you can't own, like if you're married to somebody, you can't own the house or even part of the house with your spouse, because it's not really yours. But as far as renting, now we have ministers that would come, and they were non-native, and we have a parsonage, and we just got permission from the council for them to live in the parsonage. So yeah, we can do that. If you get permission from the council, like if you were, let's say you were teaching on the reserve and you lived in Toronto, so you needed someplace to live during the week, I'm sure that you could rent someplace for the week, or stay with a family even if you wanted to. Okay, so there's our exceptions to that. Yeah, so I guess you could.
I also have another question too. Earlier when I was discussing it with you, when we were talking about the funds being provided to Native people, you said there's no actual cash being given to the person, but you said that there are some funds given to the council, right? Now my question will be regarding the household again, with the property and real estate. Is the council owning the land? Or can a person own both land and the building, or is the council owning the land?
Well, on our reserve, you can own the land. You own the land and the building. Council will loan you money if you need money to build something, about a house or whatever. They'll loan you the money, but you gotta pay that money back, just like you do a regular mortgage, right? But because we can't get money from the bank, then we do it this way. So you do own the land and you do own the house. It's just that you, if you want to sell it, you've got to keep it on the reserve. Does that answer it? Okay, yes. I'm not sure what the ratio is now. When I was teaching, it was more Native teachers than non-Native. But now I think it's more non-Native, isn't it? Yeah, and I don't know why. We do have a lot of Native teachers, but maybe we're all retired, I don't know. the beginning, but I think if you're a new teacher, like we had quite a few non-native teachers too, and they were really interested in asking questions about what to do. And if somebody asked them something, they would come to one of us and say, "Can we do that?" And we would say yes or no. So I think we had a little workshop on that one time too, so that the teachers get familiar with what they can do and what they can't do. So yeah, but I'm not sure what the ratio is now. Because anyone can teach on the reserve. It's run by the federal government. So when I was working under the federal government as a teacher. Even though I was teaching in Ontario, I did not belong to any of the school boards. Okay, so it was a federal government.
So if I work in the reserve, does my income tax also get waived? No.
Only if you're Indigenous.
Only if you're Indigenous working in the reserve.
But even if you work outside,
If you work outside the reserve, you have to pay tax. If you live outside the reserve, you have to pay tax on your land tax. I can't hear you, Esther.
Is there homeless people in the reserve? Like someone looking for a house, wanting to vacate, that person making money, and then abroad, in case like the person actually homeless, they're jail for a house,
I don't know, unless maybe their parents own the house and they're able to move in, or maybe they're moving in with somebody else. I know there was one lady that came to our church once in a while, and she was homeless, and she lived in a garage. You know, and in the winter, I think, I'm not sure where she went in the winter, but, yeah, with the drug problem now, you've got people, like sometimes they go to Hamilton and Toronto and they're still living on the street. So we do have that problem too. We do have a problem there. Did you have a question here?
how or when do Indigenous people that you just practice the first time?
That they make what? They're in,
How do you just practice for the first time?
like their status card?
Yeah, I sometimes just
You get it when you're little. Your parents apply for it. Like when you're born, they'll register you. And then you'll get a status card, and this, I keep forgetting to use this. You'll get a status card, and it has your father's or mother's status number on it. And that is your status number until you get to be 18. At 18, you can apply for your own card, and you'll get your own number.
No, I mean, how Indigenous people.
He wants to know
Yeah.
when Indigenous people meet
First time.
Jesus Christ for the first time.
Well, it's different with everybody. Like if I go around the room and ask everybody here when they met Jesus Christ for the first time.
Yeah, but I mean, historically, like how they
Well, they had the missionaries. You had the Jesuit missionaries come in, and they just disregarded anything that the native people, like they just disregarded that. They didn't even learn what their religion was about, and they just said you can't do this, or you'll die, or you'll go to hell, and all this and that, which was a very poor start for missionaries in Indigenous places. Yeah, didn't work out. Sorry, I didn't understand your question.
My question to you again then is, how did you become Christian with all that residential school background and all? How did you receive Jesus Christ?
Well, I didn't have a residential school background. My parents were both Christian, and they went to the Baptist church. So I was actually born in the church and raised in the church. And I guess it just naturally I developed. Definitely. There are some people on the reserve now that won't come into the church just because of that. And at our church, we've been doing some things to try and get the community involved, and we've been having it outside for that reason, because they won't come into the church. When I got married, there was a few people that I had invited that said they would come to the reception, but they wouldn't come to the church. They said it's, and they explained why they wouldn't come into the church. So yeah, no, that's a big problem. That's why I said, if you want to come down to the reserve, you want to meet the people, you want to make friends with them, find things that you have in common. And then just through conversation, you can bring up this. And a lot of times, people will bring it up themselves and say, okay, you go to church, what's this or what's that? And that's your perfect opportunity to start talking. But not just to come in and just away you go. It's not going to work. Okay? Okay? All right, well, thank you very much. I hope I didn't just go from one topic to the other and get you all confused, but thank you very much.
Okay, at this time, I just want to ask you to share some prayer topics to us. I don't know, some prayer topics. I know I didn't tell you this ahead of time, but.
Like what to pray for?
Yes. Want to pray for it personally, or for your church, or for the reserve? If you can just share a couple prayer topics, then we'll take some time to pray before we end, and we'll end after that.
I think prayer for our church would be to pray that God will work through us and do things that He wants us to do in the community. Like a lot of times we'll pray and we say, okay, we want more people in the church. Please bring more people in the church. But I think the prayer that we should be praying is that, how do you want us to reach the people on the reserve? I think we should pray for the young people, because they're right in the middle of the drugs and the alcohol and all this sort of stuff. And when you're young and you see this going on and you see this, and they try to get you into that way of life, and it's hard for young people. Like it doesn't matter if you're Indigenous or not. So pray that the young people will stay steady on the course. Learning, believing in God and living for Him, and going on to school and coming back and trying to help their own people would be great.
Okay, at this time, can I invite Mars and Kat and Linda to come to the front? Let's come out to the front, Kat and Mars. Yeah, you can go down there. Yeah. 저희 이 시간에 그냥 짧게 이 원주민분들을 위해서 기도하는 시간을 가지고 그 다음에 이 세션을 마치려고 합니다. 나누신 것처럼 저희 교회의 가장 큰 이슈들이 하나가 한 가지 말씀드리면, 오실경 베프티스트 처치에 가보시면 아시겠지만 많은 분들이 다 고령이세요. 다 할머니 할아버지들 분들이라 항상 저한테 물어보는 게, 어떻게 전도를 하면 모르겠다, 어떻게 이제 어린아이들의 대상으로 전도를 하면 모르겠다, 그거를 좀 위해서 기도하려고 계속 요청을 해주시거든요. 해가지고 우리 그 오실경 베프티스트 처치를 위해서 기도할 때 좀 이분들에게 지혜와 그리고 또 부흥과, 교회의 부흥과를 위해, 그런 것들을 위해서 기도했으면 좋겠고, 그리고 또 그중에 또 추가해서 어린 아이들이 교회에 나오기 시작해서 좀 교회에 좀 보탬이 될 수 있기를 위해서 기도했으면 좋겠습니다. 그래서 다 같이 기도했으면 좋겠고, 제가 마침 기도를 하고 이 세션을 끝내도록 하겠습니다. So we're gonna pray for you with those prayer topics, and I'm gonna end in prayer. Okay? Alright, thanks. 기도하겠습니다.